I'm going to just read a couple of verses from chapter 6 of the Dhammapada, the sage or the wise one. Like someone pointing to treasure is the wise person who sees your faults and points them out. Associate with such a sage. Good will come of it, not bad, if you associate with one such as this. Let one such as this advise you, instruct you, and restrain you from rude behavior. Such a person is pleasing to good people, but displeasing to the bad. Do not associate with evil friends. Do not associate with the lowest of people. Associate with virtuous friends. Associate with the best of people. So I wanted to share these words because they really speak to what we're all doing here, what we're all working towards, coming to a closer understanding of what reality is, what goodness is, what the Buddha taught, which is the end of suffering. And one of the ways that we work towards this is working in relationship with others. And most of us probably know that the Buddha advised very strongly that spiritual friendship is a very big part of our lives. In fact, it is one of the most important directional factors in how we're going to get on spiritually, how we're going to maintain our practice. In the monastery here, we have made this decision to sign up for what probably seems to a lot of people quite an extreme level of commitment to our spiritual life. And some of the rules we follow might seem arcane or out of date. But just like in lay life you take the precepts, probably you've all heard of the 5 precepts, maybe the 8 precepts, to keep you within safe moral boundaries. In the monastery, we just take on extra precepts. So we have those same precepts that you follow, but we have extra precepts to train us as constantly as possible to be mindful and vigilant and to fully appreciate this opportunity. Because if we don't constantly remember that we are monastics receiving this amazing and rare opportunity through the goodness of others, then we're not making proper use of it. So it's this constant reminding. And we sign up to do this in groups, in spiritual communities, and we sign up with people who might have different ways of being, different priorities, but actually we all share the one crucial priority, which is to uphold the Dhamma. And so with this very important commonality, we have these lives of great richness where we start off maybe going into monastic life with expectations. And in my case, I've started off with all my conditioning and preconceptions about myself and others, but really looking at what is this, having quite a lot of trepidation as I started off on 8 precepts and then moved on to 10 and then took on a lot more precepts. And what is this? What am I doing? Is it a safe thing to do? What am I going to gain from it? What are other people going to make of me? Am I going to be a success? All of these fears, questions, really relating to what's going on around me, and Is it appropriate for me? Can I do this? And as time goes on, the routines, the rules that we have, the meditation guidance, the teachings of the Buddha, all point us, lay and monastics, towards examining our experience on an everyday, moment-by-moment basis and becoming comfortable with this, turning to this habit pattern of not judging, or working towards not judging, observing but not judging. And that means not judging the judging, because judging will come up in our minds. I'm sure we're all here because we have suffered, we judge the suffering, we judge ourselves, we can fear the future, and we can get very, very tangled up in the thinking patterns, past habits, things from when we were very small children that impacted us greatly and have skewed our perceptions of what's going on the outside and the inside. So very much judgment of ourselves, judgment of others. This is how we become as humans unless we're taught to examine. And so in the monastery and in lay life, we can learn to gradually look at how do we relate to others, how do we relate to ourselves. And the meditation practice brings us stability. This can grow quite gradually and slowly, often, but by steadying ourselves in the meditation practice and bearing with our experience, we develop this familiarity with watching the mind like a scientist. And the mind can become stable around watching the mind in the same way that it can become stable around watching the meditation object. So we can spend our whole day, if we're being very mindful, just watching our reactions to what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, think. And bearing with that, seeing the pleasantness, the unpleasantness, the desire, the aversion. And in community, we see that in ourselves and in other people. We see our own reactions, we see the reactions of others. In a close spiritual community, as in family life, as in some workplaces, you can become very familiar with how other people are likely to react and what that's really saying about ourselves. Our observations and judgments of how other people react relate very much to how we relate to ourselves. And so there's this constant reference back to how are things being held? What is the state of the mind? And taking responsibility for the state of our own mind. And this becoming an observer does not mean that we're opting out of life and not making decisions and being proactive and trying to relate to others positively and well. But it does mean that we're seeing day by day the limitations of our thinking mind. This constant, or can be often constant, relationship to others and ourselves through thoughts, which are limited and are taught, and we cling to these thinking patterns because they're very, very familiar to us. So uncovering the preoccupation with ourselves that can be so draining, deadening, limiting, and quite difficult to face up to these things, but it's hugely illuminating, because once we see things clearly, we see their limitations, and we start spreading our feelers into what is beyond these limitations, what is beyond the limitations of our thinking minds. So gently feeling into that. And I found one of the most moving ways of discovering more about the limitation of my own thought processes has been learning to trust and love the way in which other people bear with my limitations. So it's a mutual process that we do with others, because of course we're not perfect. We have spiritual friends, good friends who we trust, and we learn to bear with their limitations. And this is what I found one of the most valuable things about living in a monastic community, that people who I wouldn't necessarily have a lot in common with, I actually have a huge amount in common with. The commonality is overwhelming because we share this love of the truth. And that's what we're doing here tonight, is we're sharing our love of the truth. And so we look into each other's faces, we see the posture, everyone's sitting quite still. We're receptive to each other. And that is everything. This receptivity. Because if I can trust others, I can learn to trust myself more. I can learn, despite my limitations, I can learn to be more whole through being in communion and companionship and community with others. And this doesn't mean that we become boundaryless sponges to absorb whatever's going on there in the world, because the world, as everyone here knows, is not always an easy place. Our minds are not always easy places. Our reactions to the world can throw us completely off beam. But it does mean that we get a taster of coming back to something which is bigger than ourselves, beyond ourselves, more trustworthy than our ideas about this thinking mind, this incessant flow of thoughts that can make us high, make us low, really darken our days, drag us into chronic depression, exhilarate us. We can feel pulled and pushed about by our ideas about the world, our ideas about ourselves. But this training is coming to trust that this is not the whole story. In fact, that we're getting beyond story. So the biggest kind of touch points for me in my monastic training have been learning to trust and have more faith in others, learning to trust and have more faith in the practice, in my process. My process, which isn't my process, but the process that has been learnt through being with wise beings, through learning wise teachings, through having opportunities to reflect. And it helps to, as a monastic, to look into the faces of my spiritual companions in the morning and see how all of us, we just carry on. We carry on every day. We show up. We're not giving up. We're not disrobing. We're committed to this. Just like you come to this group, you're committed to this. That's a gift to others. You know, even if it was a struggle to come tonight, it's a gift. Even if we can't see your face and we see your name, it's like you're here with us. So there's a memorial to Ayya Medanandi's parents. There's a stone with an engraving on in our property here, just at the back of the temple. And it says, like the hollow reed that becomes a flute, empty yourself of fear and be the pure love you seek. And so I like to ponder this because our lives can be very ruled by fear. Our personalities, even if we don't feel like a fearful type, can be very fear-based. A lot of us, maybe most of us, fear to die, fear to be abandoned, fear pain. It's normal to fear these things. And actually, as we observe our lives, we can see that fear can come up quite a lot. And we can learn through our practice to watch the fear. But this beautiful saying resonates because it points us to what is left when the fear is gone. What is left of ourselves? What is left of the world, our perception of the world, when there is no fear? And that's our exploring Dhamma tentacles, our growing Buddha nature, is a reaching out into that investigation. Not to push away fear, but to learn what our relationship is to it. Because by truly observing it, just like we look at each other's faces, we look at the face of fear, gradually in our practice, then we can see what is not fear. What is not fear? So I wonder if anyone has any questions about practice.
So I have a question about vulnerability and sensitivity. Do you see that as being something that arises when we're opening or when we're moving into seeing ourselves in a deeper way?
That's a very interesting question, isn't it? Because it brings up the way that we look at ourselves and judge ourselves. The number one question that probably comes up in most people's minds is, how vulnerable and sensitive am I? We all have opinions on who we are, what we're like, and we compare ourselves to others all the time. I'm vulnerable and sensitive, but you're not. And we are vulnerable. Human beings are vulnerable. And we are sensitive. We're very sensitive. But we have different ways of holding that. And some people may be more aware of it than others. And sensitivity can be something that is a very natural thing. Like little babies are sensitive and open in a very beautiful way. But as adults, we have patterns of thinking and behavior. You can call it conditioning, which relates to our past experience. And sensitivity can be pathological. We can be so sensitive that we can't relate to other people. Or we can be sensitive and very, very caring. So it all really depends how pure it is. Is it something that's coming from our hearts in a very natural way, or is it a perceived part of our personality that we get tangled up in? So I've got to be perfectly honest and say that I've always seen myself as sensitive and vulnerable, and I don't think it's necessarily helped me. The sensitivity and awareness of vulnerability that has come through developing my practice, like a big question mark, like feeling into the unknown, learning from others, and developing spiritual qualities. So that natural sensitivity, that inner opening to what is true, seems to me quite different than the labeling that I used to give myself of, I am an easily hurt, easily manipulated, sensitive, vulnerable person. That didn't help me. Thank you for the question. Any kind of clarifying question you would like to ask?
My question is, have you had any thoughts on the ways that you've found or witnessed the practice and how the practice might manifest in the scientific world, in the lay world for people outside of the monastery, and the ways that you saw the form of the practice being used by others, or ways you applied it yourself to the way the modern scientific and research world operates?
That's a very interesting question. So I trained in the medical field, and then I went on to teach science in high school, and it didn't stop me suffering. I'm very interested in science. I love the scientific process. I used to teach inquiry to high school kids. I love the kind of inquiry aspect of the scientific process. And I find science fascinating because it's all about thinking, and I love to think. But it's really a relief to move in a direction which is beyond thinking. So to kind of put it down, it's a relief to put the science down. So I find science and the scientific process and scientific knowledge really amazing in terms of the natural world, looking at the nature of what the body is, how we relate to the natural world, using the natural world as a metaphor for our practice and the process of practice. So learning from the natural world about death, about illness, seeing how everything is changing in nature and in constant motion, how everything that we perceive and think relates to movement and measurement. I find a great stimulation to looking beyond movement and measurement. So, sounds like you're probably a scientist yourself, and you know that we can only function because the molecules that we're made of are moving. We can only have heat in our bodies because everything is moving. You may well know that atoms are mostly empty space. And so, how do these things relate to this life that we live, this world that we live in? The empty space, the dying, the changing. So in that way, I find science, nature, the natural world, a fascinating way to explode outwards into the beyondness. And we're sitting here, and the Buddha said our bodies are like foam. We're mostly empty space. We look at the space between our bodies, and then we look at the bodies, they look solid, but they're mostly empty space. These things I find useful to reflect on. But I'm very happy to put down a lot of thinking about the complexity of science because it is limited. It's about words, and they're not going to take us beyond words. The Dhamma, the teachings of the Dhamma are words that point to beyond words.